I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to this edition of On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell with Judicial Watch. Your Second Amendment rights are under attack, and some politicians are ready to call you a domestic terrorist. In addition to that, we have American businesses across the country who are either being pressured into taking radically anti-gun stances in their public policy and they're dealing with their customers, or they've elected to virtue posture and get ahead of the curve by attempting in some way to placate the anti-gun left and at the same time develop a positive image in the media. And that's obviously a highly questionable prospect. Joining us for a discussion today on the Second Amendment, on gun rights, on red flag laws, on law-abiding Americans being called domestic terrorists, and other issues are Rachel Bovard, Senior Policy Director with the Conservative Partnership Institute, Dr. John Lott, President of the Crime Prevention Research Center and author of the book More Guns, Less Crime, among others, and our good friend Cam Edwards, formerly of NRA TV, now the editor of the website Bearing Arms, an important resource for folks interested in the Second Amendment and gun rights. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We appreciate your time. I think it's very important in order to frame up this issue and to discuss the question of Second Amendment rights, where the country is going, what the dialogue is even like. And I'm going out on a limb to call it dialogue. Mostly it's screaming. I think it's very important to understand what the positions are of various persons who would like to lead this country into the next 4 years, next 8 years. And so I have a little bit of video teed up, and we're going to go to the video in just a second. It runs for about 3 minutes, but I think it's important because you get to see from their own mouths what persons say who wish to be president of the United States. So let's go to the video, please.
I'm the only candidate on this stage calling for a ban and buyback of every single assault weapon in America. I've seen the plans of the other candidates here. They would all leave 15 million assault weapons in our communities. They wouldn't do a single thing to save a single life in Parkland.
I believe that what we need is comprehensive gun legislation that, among other things, provides universal background. We end the gun show loophole. We end the straw man provision. And I believed in 1988, and I believe today.
Why would you leave 15
assault weapons are weapons from the military, and that they should not be on the streets of America.
This is not about saying we're going to take everyone's guns away. We're saying we need reasonable gun safety laws, including universal background checks. And to your point, Chris, a renewal of the assault weapons ban. It's just the right thing to do.
As somebody who is very familiar from my military training with weapons of war, somebody who carried a rifle and a pistol around a foreign land on the orders of the president, there are some weapons that just don't belong in our neighborhoods in peacetime in America. We've already decided that this is within the Second Amendment because we've decided that somewhere in between a slingshot and a nuclear weapon, we can draw a line. And that's not unconstitutional, it's common sense.
I'm the guy that got the Brady bill passed, the background checks, number one. Number two, we increased that background check during the Obama-Biden administration. I'm also the only guy that got assault weapons banned, and the number of clips in a gun banned. And so, folks, look, and I would buy back those weapons. We already started talking about that. We tried to get it done. I think it can be done, and it should be demanded that we do it, and that's a good expenditure of money. And lastly, we should have smart guns. No gun should be able to be sold unless your biometric measure could pull that trigger. It's within our right to do that. We can do that. Our enemy is the gun manufacturers, not the NRA.
We can do the things that are sensible. We can do the universal background checks. We can ban the weapons of war. But we can also double down on the research and find out what really works, where it is that we can make the differences at the margins that will keep our children safe.
Do you support a mandatory buyback program or just voluntary?
I'm comfortable with a voluntary buyback program. I believe that if we pair a voluntary buyback program with a ban on these assault weapons, and requiring people who still have one to register that, then that we can make the progress that we need to make so that these weapons do not end up in the hands of people that shouldn't have them.
They talked about universal background checks where you close every loophole. We know that they save lives. Talked about ending the sales of assault weapons into our communities. Those weapons of war were designed to kill people as effectively and as efficiently as possible. They should belong on the battlefield and not in our communities. Red flag laws so that if someone poses a danger to themselves or to someone else, they're stopped before it's too late. And what I found in each one of those 254 counties is that Democrats and independents and Republicans, gun owners and non-gun owners alike, agreed.
Gun confiscation, right? If the government is buying back, how do you not have that conversation?
Well, that's not confiscation. You
Right.
would give them the offer to buy back their gun. But I'll say this. I look at these proposals and I say, does this hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand, coming from a proud hunting and fishing state? These proposals don't do that. When I was a prosecutor, I supported the assault weapon ban.
We show that video because, frankly, it's an encyclopedia of lies, disinformation, mischaracterization, and I think it really sort of illuminates the lack of knowledge on the part of all these politicians with respect to gun ownership, actually what the devices, the inanimate objects themselves do or don't do. But that's an entirely consistent line of thought, and I think it's one that really merits our attention. Rachel, I know in this coming week, as we kick off in the next few days, there's going to be all sorts of activity on Capitol Hill, everything from red flag laws to attempts to institute buyback programs. Give me a little insight as to what's going on the Hill in the next few days.
Yeah, the House, led by Democrats, is very, very ginned up on this issue. They want to pass red flag laws. They want to ban high-capacity magazines. A lot of them are talking about reinstituting the assault weapons ban, which you heard in that clip, which, to clarify, never actually banned assault weapons because there's no federal definition of assault weapon.
Scary black rifles.
Correct, yeah, and it actually just banned cosmetic features of certain weapons, and that's all it did. But we're going to see this coming out of the Democrat House, and I think it's going to put pressure on some Republicans to take a position on whether or not you want to be for red flag laws or for some of these things, or you want to stand up for Second Amendment rights. And so the Republican Senate, you've heard Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say he is not going to put a piece of gun legislation on the floor of the Senate unless the president will sign it. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, about where the president stands. I think the president has been clear that he wants to protect Second Amendment rights. However, members of his family are for red flag laws. So I think there's a lot of confusion over where I think this debate is going to go in the next week.
I think confusion is the operative word. John, you're a master of facts and data and statistics. You're an empiricist. After this video clip we just saw, I mean, what does your lifelong study in this field tell you?
Well, I guess frustration. I mean, I want to do something. I see these mass public shootings. I've been talking about what can be done to stop them for 20 years now. But I listen to the proposals, like background checks on private transfers of guns. It's been the #1 proposal for years by Democrats. And yet there's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped by having that law in effect.
So, I mean, you can't say that enough. In the last century, background checks, the type they're talking about, would not have resulted in preventing.
Not a single one of these attacks. And, you want to be serious. If they really care about these things as much as they say, then let's look at things that actually do matter. I mean, to me, one of the big things is these gun-free zones. We have virtually all these mass public shootings, about 95% of them keep on occurring in places where people aren't allowed to protect themselves. These killers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. They want to go to places where victims can't defend themselves because they know the more people they can kill, the more media attention that they can get.
And what's so counterintuitive is that everything else that we value, we guard, right? Whether it's a bank, whether it's a public official, whether it's some sensitive government installation, anything that we think has some sort of value or merit that we hold dear, we guard, often with folks that are armed.
Right.
And then we create gun-free zones that are essentially targets for lunatics and the disgruntled to act violently against.
Look, anybody who reads the diaries or looks at other statements for these killers know that they've put a lot of planning into these attacks. I mean, 6 months is about the shortest amount of time, a year, 2 years. The Sandy Hook killer spent 2.5 years planning these attacks. These guys are obsessed with getting more media attention than other attacks have. You'll frequently say, if I can only kill more people than such and such did, I can get even more media attention. And so, it's not too surprising or shocking that they look to see who might be able to stop them. And guards are helpful, but guards, a police officer at a school has real limits. If you have one person in uniform at a school who's identified as a guard and he's the only person with a gun, these killers have real strategic advantages. Who's the first person that they're going to kill in that case? Because they know if they kill that person, they're going to have free reign to go after other people there. The advantage of having teachers carrying is that you take away that strategic advantage.
Correct.
The killer doesn't know who it is that they have to take out first. I mean, anybody, nationwide, we have over 7% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. You go to movie theaters or restaurants or grocery stores, and it's very likely that somebody nearby you has a concealed handgun, but you would never know unless something bad happens, and the same is true with teachers or others.
Cam, you are steeped in the activist world of Second Amendment rights protection. You know people, you know organizations, you know individual firearms owners, you know organizations. What's the take? I mean, not Washington, D.C. and New York and L.A. and that entire bubble world. Out in the rest of the country, where it really matters, frankly. What are people thinking? What are the concerns?
Well, I think gun owners are really concerned that that in an attempt to try to make us safer, we're actually going to make life more dangerous for law-abiding Americans. As John pointed out, all of the efforts here are focused on legal gun owners. There's not been one Democratic candidate who's mentioned violent criminals who are driving the vast majority of violent crime in this country. If you look at any given city, Baltimore, Maryland, Chicago, that's dealing with a violent crime problem, the people who are instigators of that violence are known to law enforcement. They're known to the good people in the bad neighborhoods. But time and time again, they're arrested, they're given a slap on the wrist, they're put right back out on the streets. And instead of dealing with our failed criminal justice system, each and every one of those Democratic candidates says, well, the answer is to go after Mr. or Mrs. America and take their guns away, and hopefully there'll be some sort of trickle-down effect that will ultimately impact those who are actually causing harm on our streets.
So law-abiding Americans who go into a gun store, find the firearm they're interested in, go through the process of purchasing it. Often folks who go through additional training, folks who want to get a concealed carry permit usually have to go through an entire process. Those folks are predisposed to following the law, right? They're doing all the things that are law-abiding, and yet somehow they come under the microscope, and they're the ones that are going to be checked, double-checked, rechecked, when really, in my view, it's a mental health issue. And when it comes to, and we'll bring this up a little bit later in greater depth, but when it comes to things like red flag laws, when you look at the killers that you've talked about, Rachel, I don't know what your instincts are with respect to this, but there's this lack of will on the Hill to address the real underlying problem. They go for cosmetics.
No, I think that's right. And I think, to Cam's point, the classic textbook case of this is the Odessa shooter, that tragic shooting that took place in Odessa, Texas. The shooter actually had a misdemeanor, should have been locked up, but was given 2 years of probation, so was never incarcerated. He had mental health issues on his record, so therefore was prohibited from purchasing a firearm under federal law, was unable to do so, so the law worked. However, he obtained his weapon from an illegal private sale. So private sales are legal, regulated in many states, but this seller was doing manufacturing and selling illegally. So again, right. This is a motivated criminal. This is not a law-abiding person, taking advantage of the law. That's a classic example, I think, of the issue we're actually trying to stop. None of the solutions actually get at that. And it tells us what we already know, that criminals don't care about extra laws. They don't.
Correct.
Yeah, just to emphasize, it's not a private sale per se that caused the problem in Odessa. It's that the person was manufacturing so-called ghost guns, and he didn't have a license to be able to go and manufacture the gun. So the transfer of that gun was punishable by 5 years in federal prison for doing that crime.
Cam, there's an enormous amount of pressure being brought on American businesses. There's leverage being attempted in order to force businesses to change their practices and to really sort of influence, culturally shift it through an economic attack by those on the left. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Well, right now what we've seen is that gun control advocates are asking for these companies to ban the open carry of firearms. But ideally what they really want is to ban the carrying of firearms in these establishments. We just saw 145 CEOs as well write a letter to the Senate urging them to pass quote-unquote universal background checks as well as red flag laws. This includes the CEOs of Twitter, of Yelp, of Airbnb. So you got a lot of folks in the tech industry, which frankly, a decade ago was very libertarian in its outlook, but now has become much more authoritarian in its outlook. And they are trying to use this corporate pressure to change the culture. Gun control advocates are very good at identifying influencers, be them celebrities, politicians, or again, corporate CEOs, and using that influence to try to leverage their position into cultural impositions on millions of Americans.
I want to drill down on that one point. You have 145 CEOs to get together to do a letter. That wasn't spontaneous.
Not at all.
So who's behind the letter? Who generated the letter and went out and got 145 CEOs to sign up for it?
Well, the CEO of Bloomberg LP was among the signatories, so I'm guessing that Michael Bloomberg probably had something to do with it.
But I mean, that tells the story because look, you can go back through history and you look at politicians and political activists who find a crisis, whether real or manufactured, but they find a crisis, they create the conditions where there's a sense of crisis, and then they exploit it. You can read Tacitus in the Annals of Imperial Rome, you can look at the French Revolution, you can look at any number of historical instances where there's a crisis and then we must act.
Right.
The mantra of the Obama era social justice warriors was do something.
Right.
They didn't care what it was, just something.
Yeah.
And so there's an effort here, and I think it's a concerted effort, to bring this pressure to organize businesses, or at least the CEOs, to take this position. And of course, politicians on the Hill, where are they looking for campaign donations from?
Any of these groups, right? The annals of woke capitalism are now sort of turning their direction, the firepower, for lack of a better term, right on these politicians.
Right, and this is an effort, at least in my view, of taking a crisis, whether real or manufactured, and of course, the real crisis, right? No one in the world, the horrific shootings, I'm not for a moment trying to trivialize or minimize those. They are horrific. But there's consequences where very savvy, very sharp political operatives leverage the tragedy for their own political agenda.
Yeah, I don't think they care about background checks per se, at least the gun control people. They could have passed this 20 years ago. There's just a few, what I would argue, very reasonable changes that they could make, and they refuse to do. So for example, we're in Washington, D.C. If I were to give you a gun here, it would cost $125 to go and do the background check. We're not talking about the cost of the gun or the licensing or registration fees, just simply the cost of the background check. If I believe they reduce crime, they would reduce crime for everybody, not just you and I in the transfer that's involved there. And if everybody benefits, why not have everybody pay? More importantly, if you want to encourage people to do the background checks, why make me have to pay a $125 fee to obey the law? You would think you'd want to encourage people to do it rather than tax. So one obvious solution is just pay for it out of general revenue if you really think it reduces crime for everybody.
The government should bear the cost.
But
if you want to have a system that works, well, then they should pay the cost of having the system.
If you bring that up to Democrats, they will fight you tooth and nail against that. Just to give one out of, I'll give you 20 examples like this. A few years ago, some politicians in Colorado called me up when they were passing the universal background check there, asking me what amendments I would put up. And one suggestion I had was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax on each gun transfer. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats, every other Democrat voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay this new tax. How many taxes can you think of where Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay?
That's a good point.
As we slide out of this segment, I just want to ask Cam a question.
Sure.
Is it really about guns, Cam?
In a way. John, it's not about gun safety, because their idea of gun safety is don't own a gun. And every one of these proposals is designed to inhibit legal gun ownership. So it is about guns. It is also about control. It is about, moving this country forward and becoming a modern nation, just like those European nations that have, taken the guns out of the hands of people. But ultimately, I think it is about reducing freedom. It's about imposing their will on tens of millions of Americans, 100 million gun owners in this country.
That is exactly the point. It has nothing to do with the inanimate object. It has everything to do with constraining, restricting, and taking those pesky 10 amendments and boiling them down to a more manageable 4. I mean, that's really what they're looking for.
Exactly.
It's a philosophical thing. They've got a device to do it. Stand by. We're going to come back in just a few moments and pick up our conversation on the Second Amendment, gun rights, and how some politicians think of you as a domestic terrorist. Thanks for joining us on Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. We're talking about the Second Amendment, gun rights, efforts by politicians to declare American citizens domestic terrorists, and a host of other issues to include red flag matters. This is a cornucopia of Second Amendment issues that we're talking about with our good friends Rachel Bovard, Senior Policy Director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Dr. John Lott, a renowned expert on all matters concerning crime prevention, gun rights, etc., and also our good friend Cam Edwards, who is an activist and probably one of the most knowledgeable people with respect to the Second Amendment and your rights as a firearms owner, or even just someone who's interested in constitutional questions. Cam is the man to talk about all the topics we've outlined. I want to go to San Francisco, that bastion of conservatism.
Why, Chris? Why would you want to go there?
I don't think I'd be given a visa to enter the city. But San Francisco in the last week came out with a pretty outrageous, in my view, statement from the city council. It was offered in advance by a supervisor, District 2 Supervisor Catherine Stefani. And we've got some of the language of the San Francisco pronouncement against the NRA, where they say that the city and county of San Francisco should take every reasonable step to assess the financial and contractual relationships of our vendors and contractors with respect to domestic terrorist organizations. And that's framed with calling the National Rifle Association domestic terrorists. So there's the financial leverage that we touched on as we went out of the last segment of our show. This is an effort to strong-arm businesses, banks, other retail entities, into not cooperating with, being friendly towards, in any way, gun ownership. The council goes on from there and talks about how they encourage all of the jurisdictions, including other cities, states, and federal government, to adopt similar positions. Here's a city council saying that the National Rifle Association, one of the oldest, largest organizations, citizens, individual rights organizations in the country, that organization, and I guess by inference, NRA members, are domestic terrorists. How does the city council get away with that?
Well, I don't know if they do, because they've been sued by the National Rifle Association for that statement, as well as, again, the efforts to try to block businesses from working with the NRA. It's one thing to see this type of language on social media. I've seen the hashtag NRA is a terrorist organization, and you'll find, left-leaning activists that'll use that. It's another thing, though, to see, an actual governmental body make a declaration that you see on social media, right? And as you say, if they're declaring the NRA to be a domestic terror organization, that means that the millions of NRA members must be domestic terrorists.
Correct.
And that is absolutely outrageous, to call the millions of men and women, who are moms and dads, who are teachers, police officers, firefighters, soldiers, veterans, Medal of Honor recipients, to call them domestic terrorists. Look, it'd be nice to be able to just excuse this as grandstanding on the part of politicians, but it really has to be dealt with, because I think this is a really ugly chapter in the culture wars that the San Francisco supervisors have opened up.
This Catherine Stefani, the supervisor, she was quoted as saying that the NRA had it coming. What does that tell you about sort of the disposition, her mindset, or it is probably one of the most outrageous acts by a municipal body against a group of citizens. They make outrageous claims. In one part, they say that the NRA promotes extremist positions, they undermine the general welfare, and that they have incited gun owners to acts of violence. I mean, first of all, it's a lie. I mean, those are multiple lies. And yet you have an entire city council come out and offer this as their position and encourage other municipalities to do so. Here's my concern. Who else is going to jump on the bandwagon?
Well, the state of New Jersey. has jumped on the bandwagon. And this week, the New York Times is reporting the state of New Jersey will no longer do business with gun manufacturers who don't abide by the standards New Jersey wants them to, which are far and away beyond what federal law already requires for background checks, for safety, for manufacturing. And so this is, I think, an ugly chapter, as you said, in the culture wars, when you start to use state power and state-sponsored power in pursuit of advocacy, and the kind of advocacy that strips people of their constitutional rights, not just your Second Amendment rights, but your First Amendment rights as well. And we're seeing this not only at the state level, but at the corporate level, which we talked about a little bit, but banks like Citi and Bank of America no longer making lines of credit out to gun manufacturers or people that want to own firearms. I mean, this is now, the way people interact with society is now being restricted simply because someone wants to exercise their Second Amendment rights. This is, I think we are in an uncharted territory when you see this kind of advocacy at this kind of compelling of people's
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of that executive order in New Jersey, another component of that executive order actually directs the state treasurer to investigate whether or not financial institutions have established codes of conduct for businesses within the firearms industry that they may provide financing for. Now, it doesn't direct the state to divest or to stop doing business with these companies, but clearly that's the next step. And so you're right, you know, they are willing to use, if they can't use the legislature, if they can't use Congress, if they can't use the judiciary, can't use the regulatory agencies, then they'll go and they'll try to use private enterprise. And they'll try to bully private enterprise into adopting practices that amount to a limitation or an elimination of our constitutional rights.
I mean, this is not new. I mean, during the Obama administration, you had Operation Choke Point, which went and essentially put pressure on financial institutions to make it so that people who were selling guns or whatever found that they couldn't run credit cards. You know, that they had troubled banks or others that they had financial relationships with for decades were being pressured by the federal government into breaking those relationships, making it costly or difficult for them to even exist. So, I mean, but, you know, I guess one question I have is if they define all the members as being domestic terrorists, does that mean they get to arrest them? I mean, they're not even saying that they're thinking about it. They're declaring that they actually are domestic terrorists. But this notion about inciting violence, you know, I don't know, partly because the media people have this image that guns are only used to do bad things. We rarely hear about defensive gun uses. At our website at crimeresearch.org, I've literally dozens of cases over the last few years where mass public shootings have been stopped by people with concealed carry permits, but you would never hear stories about them on the national news.
It is very one-sided reporting. I mean, any number of different Second Amendment or gun owner type, either whether it's a website or a magazine or any number of publications out there, you know, will list on a monthly or weekly basis all sorts of local news articles about somebody going into a 7-Eleven and trying to rob the place, and a law-abiding, gun-carrying citizen interdicting or stopping or saving someone's life. And those multiple instances, in my view at least, far outweigh the instances we have, horrific as they are.
Well, I'm talking about even mass public shootings.
Right.
I'm talking about where police or prosecutors have said that if a permit holder wasn't there, some of these are incredibly dramatic cases that would have gotten massive international attention. You know, you have cases like at a back-to-school event last year in Florida, not very far from Parkland, elementary school, hundreds of school children there. A man came in, started firing his gun. A vendor with a permitted concealed handgun seriously wounded the attacker and stopped him before he was able to go and actually hit anybody with his shots. If the vendor hadn't been there, God knows how much carnage that there would have been and how much massive international attention. As it was, the only news coverage that existed that was just in the local media market. But this has an impact in multiple ways. One is, I think if these cases got more news attention, it might discourage some people from doing the attacks. Because, and secondly, it creates a real imbalance in people's minds about the costs and benefits of guns. If they only hear about the bad things and never hear about the benefits, then how can we expect most people not to come away with such a negative view on guns?
Here's my concern. You have an institution like the City Council or the City and County Council of San Francisco declaring an organization domestic terrorists. Thereby, it's reasonable to infer that the persons who belong to that organization obviously must be domestic terrorists. Well, then what's the enforcement that you do for
Right.
people who are designated domestic terrorists?
Somebody
Well, the
arrest them.
enforcement is seizure, right? Because how can you allow domestic terrorists to have weapons? And this
How
isn't
can you allow domestic terrorists to walk around the streets?
correct. And we've seen, and people have a little bit of amnesia about this, we've seen post-Katrina, Mayor Ray Nagin in New Orleans do what? Order gun confiscation,
Right.
where police went door to door and took weapons away. So this is not far-fetched. This is not some enormous leap of, oh, you're being hysterical or you're exaggerating. We have proof of that sort of behavior and conduct. And if people don't think that's an assault on their Second Amendment rights, they need to rethink the situation.
Just
And
one fast thing. I would just say, it's not, to me, it's just not an assault on Second Amendment rights. The way I usually try to phrase it, it's an assault on their safety. The fact that you make it so that people can't defend themselves, it's a safety issue, not just a Second Amendment rights issue.
For your safety, stay tuned to the rest of the show. We'll be back in just a moment. Thanks for joining us on Watch. We're talking about the Second Amendment, gun rights, public safety, efforts by various politicians, both pro and con, your constitutional rights to take action in what is perceived to be a national crisis concerning firearms and public safety. We have a great bunch of panelists joining us today, coming back to our discussion. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we originally saw was some of our presidential candidates from the Democratic Party talking about stepping up and increased calls for things with respect to enforcement from their point of view, whether just one more law is somehow going to make everything magically better. And I think there's substantial evidence to prove otherwise. But nonetheless, one of the things you hear about over and over again are gun buyback programs. And it's my contention that gun buybacks are nothing more than the first step to what in the end amounts to confiscation of firearms. It's masquerading as that. And so we heard Beto O'Rourke avidly talking about wanting to buy back or in some way compel the return of every, what he refers to as assault weapon, whatever that means. I could talk about a modern sporting rifle. We could talk about a lot of different terminology. But so gun buybacks, Cam, how does that work? Explain to everybody how that's going to make everybody safer.
Well, first of all, it's not a buyback. It's a compensated confiscation. That's exactly what it is. When you have a mandatory, when the government says, hand over your guns and I'll give you some money, or you become a criminal, that's confiscation. You really don't have a choice. Your choice is keep my gun and become a criminal, or obey the government and hand over my gun. How this is supposed to work to make anybody safer is, honestly, it's beyond me, because there's absolutely no research that shows that voluntary buybacks make any difference whatsoever. And there's also no real research showing that American gun owners really are in the mood to comply with these types of demands. You look at New Jersey, for example. They instituted a magazine ban not long ago that requires everybody that owns a magazine that can hold more than 10 rounds to hand them over. Nobody has. Not a single magazine's been turned into any police officer in the state of New Jersey. New York State required owners of quote-unquote assault weapons to register their firearms with the state. I think the compliance rate is estimated like 4% right now. And you talk about enforcement. That's the real issue here, because there really is no way to proactively enforce these laws. You're enforcing these laws after the fact if you find somebody and this is another charge that you can tack on. So in New York State, for example, with the SAFE Act, what we're seeing is that the majority of arrests and prosecutions are coming in New York City. Emily Bazelon of Slate actually sat in the gun court in Brooklyn for 2 months. And what she found was that the people that she saw, 70% of those people who were there facing 3.5 years in prison for simply possessing a firearm without a license, 70% of them were young black men without any serious criminal history whatsoever. But they're the ones who are getting locked up and put in jail. So it's fascinating to me that you have each and every one of these Democratic candidates suggesting that our criminal justice system is broken, that it is systemically racist, that it needs to be fixed, and yet they also want to slap on another 6 or 8 or 12 gun control laws, into this criminal justice system that they say is disproportionately impacting young men of color. And not one of them will address how it is that their gun control bills would magically be different than every other law that's on the books that they say is being, racistly applied.
Here's a concern that I have, and that is that there's a whole lot of people who don't necessarily pay attention to this question, but they do pay attention to the IRS and taxes. And so I have in the back of my mind this notion of a savvy Democrat saying if you turn in your weapons, we'll give you an IRS tax credit. That would get the attention of all sorts of people who are otherwise indifferent, on the fence, not motivated. And when they start handing out tax credits, because that always gets, sadly, the center right will get excited about anything having to do with having their taxes lowered. And so some savvy Democrats can say, we're going to give you an IRS tax credit for the full retail value of whatever weapon you turn in. And I think that that would actually be, in some perverse way, a greater motivator of having people actually line up and start turning weapons in. But like you said, that is the first step, and it's just masquerading as gun confiscation.
Well, I think the other thing about buyback programs, the rhetoric around them that is just so ridiculous, is that the term buyback infers that you're giving it back to the person who owned it originally, which is the government. No, I don't think so. In fact, that's why the Second Amendment exists, is so the government doesn't own your gun. But I think to the point that Cam made about there's no empirical research that suggests that they work, this has been studied because states have tried this. We have examples of states implementing voluntary buyback programs. There is, I think, in the words of one researcher, not any statistically significant impact on the reduction of crime in these communities. And usually what you see is people just getting their broken guns out of the attic, right? Grandpa's gun, and bringing it in and getting money for it. And basically you're getting no guns off the street and you're not having any impact on the crime rate.
John, when it comes to numbers, you're the guy who knows.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the big push for gun buybacks is because of Australia and the claims that were being made there. What you have to understand is really it's kind of a misinterpretation of the numbers that has been there. So you had firearm homicides falling for about 15 years prior to the buyback. They continued to fall afterwards. Just imagine you had a perfectly straight line and you change the law someplace in the middle. The after average would be below the before average, and that's really all they're reporting. What you'd really want to see, does it fall at a faster rate afterwards, at a slower rate? Is there some type of discontinuity in the change? And in fact, what you see is that the rate of decline actually slowed down after the buyback. But what most people don't understand about Australia is they did have this buyback of from about 3.2 million to about 2.5 million guns. But people could go and buy guns again after that. By 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was above what it was prior to the buyback. And so what you should have seen, if these theories are right, you should have seen a big sharp drop to begin with, and then a gradual increase over time in these different crime rates. And that's not what you observe at all. You know, you look at firearm suicides, it's the same way. You had this drop that was occurring beforehand, and it's really a real misuse of statistics that are there. But I think it's the claims with regard to Australia is what's driving the debate, because I agree with Rachel and Cam that there's been a lot of studies on American buybacks, and it's one thing that criminologists and economists and others have agreed on that just hasn't had any impact.
As we close out of the segment, I want to raise another point that is near and dear to my heart, and that is I think the attention on veterans, and some people talk about veteran suicide numbers, PTSD issues. It is my firm belief, based upon some studies that I've done, some interviews, some other work, that there is a concerted effort to take veterans who are firearms owners and somehow turn them into boogeymen, to make them at risk more than anybody else. And there's a real concerted effort to sort of brand people who are veterans, myself among them. You know, my interest in it is because I'm a veteran. And I've heard all these cases of veterans being put in a position where they essentially have to prove their innocence.
Well, if a veteran gets financial help, he's classified as being mentally disabled, and he's put on the list for being banned from being able to go and buy a gun.
It's an outrageous abuse, and there's the due process violations there are off the charts. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. Thanks for joining us on Watch. We're coming back to talk about the Second Amendment, gun rights, all sorts of mischievous activity. Principally, I want to focus now on Capitol Hill. Rachel, I'd like to have your insights with respect to all sorts of efforts in this newly returning Congress to address things like red flag laws. I don't think people even understand what a red flag law is. I don't even think the people on the Hill do. But there's a lot of different initiatives going on. Kind of bring us up to speed on what's the latest.
Well, the Democrat House is going to do what we expect, which is kind of go to the extreme on a lot of these issues, and I think pass a lot of messaging legislation that they don't expect to go anywhere in the Senate. But what is going on among Senate Republicans, I think, is of concern to people that are interested in this issue. You are starting to see some Senate Republicans come out in support of red flag laws. There is legislation out there that would incentivize red flag laws at the state level, and that is co-sponsored by people like Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, Rick Scott, also the same state senator from Florida, John Cornyn, who was formerly in the Senate Republican leadership, is also a co-sponsor of that legislation. And you have efforts from Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, working with Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, to expand background checks. And this is something we saw them roll out a couple of years ago, and now they're back at it. And they are in active discussions with the White House. And so I think for people interested in this issue, it is a moving target, to go with the metaphor. And so I think if they're interested in this issue, this is something they need to speak up about.
So
now.
something I find particularly offensive with respect to the red flag laws is that that's a cute little sort of term or phrase that's used. I don't think anyone really knows what it means. What is precisely being proposed? What is the red flag? How is it? And then how is a I mean, look, there are protective orders statutes out there, at the county and state level across the country. If someone has a reasonable fear for their safety, their security, their life, they know that someone is a danger, you can go to any court, you can go to the police, you can make a claim, and there's actions already in place for protective orders. How is a red flag law different? What does that mean?
Well, so this is the key question, is how this is going to look at the federal level, because we see red flag laws across the country. It's something like 17 states now have red flag laws. And the critical question is one of due process. Because in many of these states, what happens is anyone that can be concerned, a teacher, a parent, a friend, and can make a recommendation that this person's guns be taken away. And that is then carried out in something called an ex parte hearing. That person doesn't even have to be present to defend themselves, to be present while their constitutional rights are being stripped away. Again, no crime has been committed. So this sets up a scenario where the government is stripping you of a right before you even commit a crime, if you're even going to commit a crime.
All right, this is something out of an old movie, The Minority Report, right?
Right.
With the precogs, with the precognition people would know that you're going to do something bad. I mean, the other part of this, frankly, is also we've seen people a few years back, swatting was very popular, where people would make fake phone calls to the police alleging some hostage situation, and the SWAT team would show up in front of some innocent person's house on the false premise that there was some horrific thing going on. I mean, I see this being used, and I know of an instance in particular where one politician running against another filed a protective order just to embarrass or kind of jam up the politician in their campaign. I mean, this is so ripe for abuse, for denial of constitutional rights, due process. Cam, does this even have a chance of flying?
Well, unfortunately, I think it does have a chance of flying because politicians want to do something. And many politicians feel like this is the least bad option because it's not going after everybody. It's not taking anybody's guns away, entirely, right?
Yeah.
You can have your firearm restored, exactly. So but again, the people who are pushing this are gun control advocates. And my biggest problem, yes, I have due process concerns, but my biggest problem is, so you're telling me that a judge is going to determine, based on whatever standard of review, that somebody is likely to be a danger to themselves or others, and then we're going to go and we're going to take their guns from them, and then we're going to leave them alone in their house with their car keys and their can of gas and their pills and their knives, and we're going to think that that actually solved the problem? That's ridiculous. To me, red flag laws are fundamentally unserious solutions to a very serious issue. If there is somebody who is in a crisis and who needs to be removed from their firearms, remove them from their firearms, put them in a place where they will be safe. But don't go after the inanimate objects and think that makes everything better.
Right, I mean, because the same argument, as you pointed out, you would have to seize their vehicle because they could drive through a mall and create untold havoc.
Well, they can hang themselves,
and
like Jeffrey Epstein. There are so many ways that people can kill themselves.
And we have civil commitment laws in this country in all 50 states. And I've yet to see a scenario where a red flag law or an emergency gun violence restraining order would be more appropriate than using the existing levers of civil commitment or the criminal justice system.
Rachel, is the Surrender Caucus going to give in on this and just roll over and play dead?
It is in a dangerous way right now. There is a lot of that feeling of we must do something on Capitol Hill, particularly in the Senate. And I think these red flag laws are gaining a lot of popularity because, people, again, this hysteria of the need to do something is overwhelming.
As we close out, John.
Yeah, look, as has been mentioned, we have civil commitment laws, Baker Acts. Change that in some way. Those have all sorts of protections there. You have to see a mental health care expert in the evaluation. Red flag laws, despite the mental health care discussions, has no requirements that a mental health care expert's involved. But one thing that hasn't been addressed is you can actually accomplish the opposite, make suicide more likely with red flag laws. I'll give an example for somebody that Cam knows well also, and that is, I know a woman who's being stalked. Her husband was murdered right in front of her. She was incredibly depressed afterwards. She had concerns about even seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist after the attack because she was worried that her guns would be taken away from her. What happens when you have red flag laws? You would be afraid to go, she would have been afraid to go and talk to friends or relatives for fear that even a well-meaning person would be concerned that she's depressed and that she would have her gun taken away. So this person who had killed her husband, she could be at risk. And you make the problem worse if people are afraid to even share their feelings, if they can't even talk to those around them. It's just not somebody like her. Police officers are depressed constantly on the job. Would we really be in a better world where people can't share their feelings because they're afraid? Police officer, he has his gun taken away, he loses his job at that point. And liberals understand this in other contexts. If you were to say we're going to have a list of people with AIDS, they would go and say, well, you can't do that because that will discourage people from getting testing and treatment. But somehow when it comes to guns, that type of logic that they have, that they can be these perverse consequences for these things, are things that they never think about.
When we come back, we're going to wrap up our discussion on the Second Amendment, gun rights, red flag laws, and all sorts of mischief that frankly is a great danger to the American public with respect to their constitutional rights. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us on Watch. As we go to wrap this episode of on Watch, we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of turf, and a lot of important topics, everything from people being declared domestic terrorists to this vague notion of a national red flag law. What that means, no one really knows, and there's people ready to surrender on it. We've talked about the gun buyback programs, which is really another form of confiscation, a lot of important issues. We've also talked about the lack of scientific data, of facts, of numbers with respect to these horrific mass shootings that we've experienced and what's been proposed for some sort of legislative cure for something that really is a public mental health problem largely, and not a problem about the use of inanimate objects. So listen, as we go to close, Cam, I know that there's another point or two that you'd like to discuss or cover before we shut down, but please let me know what you're thinking.
I get the political urge to do something, but we need to do something that works. We need to not just do something that is politically popular, but will be ineffective, unenforceable, and unconstitutional. And there are things that really do work to address mental health concerns, to address violent crime. Delegate Todd Gilbert in Virginia has just introduced a bill that would actually empower states to bring in Project Ceasefire, which would help get gang members out of gangs. If they don't stop shooting, they don't get out of the gangs, then they'll be prosecuted under federal law. They'll go to prison for a really long time. This program has proven to be effective. It reduced juvenile homicides in Boston by 50% back in the late 1990s. It's been used effectively around the country. It does not attack anybody's Second Amendment rights. It makes streets and communities safer. There are ways to go about improving the public safety in the society without infringing on people's constitutional rights. You just have to have the political will to do it.
John, a closing thought.
Well, I want to stop these attacks, these mass public shootings, but I want to do something that works. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is that whenever we have one of these things within an hour or two before we even know the facts, people are calling for laws that it turns out wouldn't have had anything to do with stopping these attacks. And so let's deal with things like gun-free zones. And if they want to have things like background checks on private transfers, then do serious things that would make it easy for them to pass it. They're just simple, reasonable changes.
Rachel, you get the last word.
Well, we've talked about red flag laws being disingenuous and suspect ways of addressing this issue, but I'd also like to point out that empirically they don't work. Piece out in Wired this week showing no statistically significant link between mental health reporting laws and the reduction in the homicide rate.
Cam, John, Rachel, thank you very much for joining us on what I think has been a fascinating conversation about a huge topic, a lot of different angles to it, but it's an important conversation because if we leave the dialogue, if we leave the discussion of these matters to the activists who are able to go out and round up 145 CEOs to lean on Congress, and if they're driving the train and they're driving the discussion and dialogue, the average American citizen and their constitutional rights and their safety suffers. Thanks for joining us on Watch. I'm Chris Farrell.